In the 20th century, a guy called Walter Kaufmann wrote a book called Faith of a Heretic. Walter Kaufmann was an existential philosopher. He wrote a very good book about Nietzsche, actually, for people interested in Nietzsche. And his main proposition was that all real philosophy is heretical. Well, what else could it be? If it just went along with the norms of the day, you wouldn't really call it philosophy, would you? It'd just be a reiteration of the kind of daft beliefs that people have. So today, if you would summarize the kind of beliefs that people have, because it's very, very difficult to be heretical these days. It's probably worse than during the Spanish Inquisition, because our society is absolutely hell-bent on notions such as progress and optimism, that it's very difficult to even voice an opinion around those things. You try voicing an opinion around pessimism and stagnation to your friends, and they'll just see you as some kind of aberration, and they'll no longer be your friends, I wouldn't think. Anyway, the kind of daft things that we believe today, for example, are that happiness is achievable. And you don't have to be a genius to see that the huge industry that's devoted to achieving happiness can only come about if people are unhappy. So all the spiritual self-help guru type stuff that's out there is only there because people are unhappy, and they're prepared to buy any kind of formula that they believe will make them happy. The only reason that people are unhappy is because they're unable to accept their unhappiness. Anyway, that's a podcast on its own, but I'm going to go through, I don't know, probably about a dozen philosophers and just tick off the kinds of heresy that they proclaimed in their day. Anyway, so today we believe that happiness is achievable. The whole notion of success is a notion that you dare not challenge these days. So to be successful will make you happy. To have a good relationship will make you happy. To have lots of money will make you happy. To go on your super vacation will make you happy. Whatever it is, Those are kind of common myths that most people buy into. Why? Because they're unhappy. So they have to have some ideas of the things that they can do that will make them happy. This could be a long podcast, by the way. I never know when to start these things, but looking at it, it might be quite long. And then there's materialism. Materialism is the most stupid of ideas. The simple fact that you cannot know anything that is not a product of your mind seems to pass most people by. There is, I've talked about this in the past, and I'm not going to talk about it at length, otherwise it will be a two-hour podcast. But materialism says there's a whole pile of stuff out there, and we see it pretty much as it is. It's a very, very crude idea. Because, of course, there is no colour green in reality. This is something our brains create for us. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that, but materialism is a pretty stupid idea and is being challenged to some extent by modern physics. But the scientific community is hell-bent on trying to convince us that everything is matter made out of atoms. The stupid thing is they're even trying to understand things like consciousness by trying to figure out what atoms are doing. Anyway, so two stupid things already. that happiness is achievable, that everything is made out of matter, atoms and atomic particles, that there is such a thing in the universe as meaning and purpose. People believe this. They have to believe it for whatever reason. The fact that meaning and purpose are ideas that we have invented seems to pass people by. But as you shall see, there are some philosophers who've said, well, meaning and purpose, the universe doesn't have any meaning and purpose. How could it? If it had purpose, it would mean that it had some notion of something that it needed to achieve, some ambition, which is ridiculous. If the universe is all there is, or whatever you want to call it, the all, then how can the all perceive something that is outside the all? So meaning and purpose is just a human invention. We have notions of a moral code. And of course this is now converted into notions around political correctness and the woke movement and all this kind of thing. We have to be very, very careful of what we say, or we might offend a fly or something. So, as Lao Tzu says, we only have strong moral codes when we have no morals. The fact that the world is plunging more and more and more into me, 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 and fuck everybody else is something we can't accept, and so we pretend that we're concerned about other people and about the state of the planet and so on. And we all have a notion that there's something called truth. Science struts around proclaiming that it has some kind of key to the truth. It doesn't. Again, here's another podcast, but all science is doing is telling us how our minds represent the world, not how the world is, because we can't know how the world actually is. We have this filter called our mind and our senses. Anyway, these are the non-heretical things to date. So happiness is possible. Everything is made out of atoms and atomic particles. There is a meaning to life. Life has a moral code, and there is such a thing as truth. So those things are prime candidates for being shot down. And they've been shot down in the past anyway, but people tend to ignore it. But anyway, let's go through a few people who said things that were heretical in their day. You can go back a long way. So Lao Tzu, the Taoist guy, the Tao Te Ching, he said, heaven is heartless, treating all things as straw dogs. So there isn't some big man in the sky looking after us and making sure that we get the things that we pray for and all those kind of things. No, heaven is heartless, treating all things as straw dogs. We're dispensable. He goes on to say that the sage is heartless, treating all things as straw dogs. So someone who's come to some kind of understanding kind of knows that everything is impermanent and arises and then disappears. It's a straw dog. It's dispensable. The pre-Socratics, probably the most severe of the pre-Socratic philosophers, was Parmenides, who said there is no such thing as change. Again, if this is to be a 2-hour podcast, and I don't want to do a 2-hour podcast, could talk about that. And there's a very, very nice argument in one of Plato's works about Parmenides, Plato on Parmenides, where he goes through the argument of, well, is the universe a multiplicity, or is it just one thing? And the argument goes, well, if it was one thing, then there couldn't be something to observe the one thing, because that would have to be separate in some kind of way. But then, of course, you've got a multiplicity. You've got the thing that knows it's one thing and the thing that is one thing. So it can't be one thing. And if you say it's a multiplicity, then how can you in any way form connections between things? Anyway, it's a difficult argument, in fact one of the most difficult in Plato. But Parmenides came out with this. In fact, he was called the awful Parmenides because he challenged so many of the beliefs of the day. He was heretical. And then, of course, we come to people like Jesus Christ, who said the Jewish law was not the end of the matter. They put him up on a cross for saying that. He said, hate your life if you want to reach the kingdom of heaven. Of course, most Christians ignore things like that. He said the kingdom of heaven is within, which immediately kind of makes all the priests and the purveyors of truth irrelevant. Kingdom of heaven is within. You can reach it yourself. Anyway, you all know what happened to Jesus Christ. He was a true heretic. The Buddha said it's all a shit show. And he then kind of added the caveat that if you try to get out of the shit show, you'll never get out of it. Because everything is desire, all is suffering and pain. Of course, nobody wanted to hear this stuff. I imagine the people of Buddha's day were just as hell-bent on the notion of if I can get this gold bracelet or something, or if I can do something or other, I'll be happy. But the Buddha said, no, your desires are the very cause of your unhappiness. And the worst desire of all is the desire not to have any desires. So, it's a catch-22. Then we have Plato, who said the world is a poor reflection of an ideal world of forms. So in other words, this world we live in is a kind of shoddy recreation of something that is more perfect, his world of forms. Again, that was fairly shocking for the day. And he said that the only people who should rule are the people who don't want to rule. Obviously, the people who rise to the top in political circles are usually the most narcissistic and self-promoting people in society. Are those really the people that you want running your country? Well, probably not. And then we kind of skip along. Well, there's lots of philosophers, but Descartes said doubt everything. Because you have to remember, up to the time of Descartes, it had all been theology and mysticism and all kinds of stuff like that. The Christian stuff. I'll say more about that in a short while when I speak about Nietzsche. But Descartes said doubt everything. And he said life can be understood through rationalism, through thinking about it. And in his day, that was absolutely heretical. I don't know how he got away with it, but he did. Of course, you have people like Galileo, who undermined the notion that the Earth was the center of the fucking universe. And the religious authorities of the day put him in prison for it. So you can see our progress in thinking is always heretical. So I'll get to the present day in a moment, but talk about Spinoza. As you know, Spinoza is one of my favorite philosophers. Spinoza said a whole pile of things that were heretical and was kicked out of the Jewish community in Amsterdam for saying the things he said. He said there are no final causes. In other words, the universe does not work towards some end, a final cause being some end towards which we work. The universe doesn't know some final end. And all because we tend to operate like that. We think that the universe operates like that, but it doesn't. There are no purposes. There is no purpose to the universe. It just unfolds as it unfolds. Spinoza said there's no such thing as good and evil. What is good for you, and what is evil is what is bad for you. It was as simple as that. But again, that was heretical, because the religious authorities would have it that there is a moral code that is absolute and made known to us through some transmission from God or whatever. He said there's no such thing as beauty or ugliness. It's very much in accord with the Tao Te Ching. Because as soon as you say something is ugly, then you've created a whole world of... as soon as you say something is beautiful, you've created a whole world of ugliness, because there'll be things that don't comply with your notion of beauty. Spinoza also said we're all mental automata. We have no free will. We're mental machines. And as you probably know, recent experiments around this whole thing of free will have shown that ask someone to raise one of their hands, they make a choice, raise your left hand or your right hand, and stick some electrodes on their head, and you can see that they make the decision a few seconds before they actually literally raise their right hand or left hand, but they were unaware that they'd already made the decision. We're just mental automata, according to Spinoza. And that was truly heretical in his day. In fact, as you probably know, most of his works could not be published, or some of his works could not be published in his lifetime. And I think he tried to publish, I think it was the Ethics, and he got such a kickback. Friends told him, look, for God's sake, don't publish this while you're alive. I think it was that. It might have been the Political Treatise, I can't remember. Then we get Schopenhauer, who, like the Buddha, said it's all a shit show, and that the world is driven by a will, a force, if you like, that is unconscious. The base state for existence is an unconscious state. Consciousness is some weird kind of thing, and according to Schopenhauer, consciousness was just a trick of our brain, so that during the day we could go and get the stuff we need to keep the body going. So the world is driven by this will that is unconscious and unconscionable. There is no morality in the driving force behind our existence. Again, very similar to what Spinoza said. Then we get to Nietzsche, who said, what's all this fuss about truth? There is no such thing as the truth. How can we, mortal finite creatures, have any notion of what the truth is? Through our filters, the filters that we have, our sensory and conceptual filters. How can we know what the truth is? He said, thinking does not require a thinker. Again, very similar to Spinoza, who said a similar thing. And in fact, Nietzsche considered Spinoza to be his only predecessor. He said he learned from other philosophers, but he considered Spinoza to be his only predecessor. So thinking does not require a thinker. Thinking just happens. This is Spinoza's mental automata. Nietzsche said there's no absolute morality. Morals, the moral codes of the day, generally come from a slave mentality. So in any age you have the people who are strong, dominant, the power possessors of the day, and everybody else says, well, this isn't fair, we should have all that, blah blah blah. And he gives the example of the Jews who were oppressed for a long time, who developed a moral code that was around charity and kindness and giving and blah blah blah. He said this is the morality of a slave. The strong people don't have this kind of, or the dominant people don't have this kind of morality. Why would they? I'm afraid it's the old thing of those who matter don't complain. Those who complain don't matter. So moral codes always come from the weak part of society. You may not agree with that, but it is heretical. And Nietzsche, as you probably know, had a big thing about religion. Religion being basically the dogmas of the weak. And he particularly targeted Christianity and to some extent Buddhism. And Nietzsche was, as you may or may not know, pretty much the first existentialist. He called reason into doubt. And again, that was heretical in its day. Descartes and Spinoza had said reason is our way out of the labyrinth, which was heretical because it was supposed to be based on religious law and faith, but they were saying no, it's reason. And then Nietzsche comes along and says, actually, reason isn't such a big deal because we're driven way more by our desires and emotions. And then we come to people like Dostoevsky, who also reiterated that reason is just a tiny part of us. And the great thing about us is that we can be, what's the word? We can be impulsive and difficult. We don't have to be reasonable. There's no earthly reason why we should have to be reasonable. We can be impulsive, spontaneous, all those kinds of things. And Dostoevsky, his foundational philosophical work, which is very short, which is called Notes from Underground, actually, in there he actually says, oh well, maybe reason is 20% of what we are. All the rest of it is this unholy mess, our desires, our emotions. And why should we be controlled by reason? What decree has been laid down that we should be controlled by reason? Anyway, we move on, and today we have, well, I've missed one person out actually, and that's Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant said something really, 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 really important. In fact, maybe one of the most important things in the whole of philosophy. And it tends to be overlooked these days because it's definitely not fashionable. But he said, the only world we know is the world that our mind represents to us. So a simple and trivial example is that if we look at rail tracks going into the distance, they look as though they come together. Of course they don't, we know that. The sunlight looks like it revolves around the earth, but we know it doesn't. So, this is a very superficial view of what he was saying. But he said that space and time are properties of our consciousness, not properties of the world. And that we can only know the way our minds represent the world to us. It was called idealism, and his particular version of it was transcendental idealism. Now, idealism is extremely unpopular these days, which is why if you want to be a heretic these days, you talk in terms of idealism. Because it totally undermines the whole of, well, it doesn't undermine, but it puts a different slant on the whole of the endeavour called science. Because what it says, what idealism says, is all we are studying is the way our minds represent the world, not the world itself. Anyway, so that was heretical. Fortunately for Kant, no fucker understood what he was talking about. And in the main still doesn't. Most people still don't understand it. It's like there's some mental block, some collective mental block that cannot just understand the simple fact that the only world we know is the world as our mind represents it to us. It's a simple statement, but people just do not seem to be able to jump on board with that one. Anyway, there are movements today, both in psychology and philosophy, that reinforce that. There's a guy called Kastrup, can't remember his first name, Kastrup, K-A-S-T-R-U-P, who is, he's talking about a similar thing, that the world is our representation of the world. Unfortunately, these philosophers and psychologists, very often they don't give credit where it's due, so they don't refer back to Kant. But that's where they've got the idea from ultimately, so it's Kastrup with the idealism. And one of the most profound books, in my opinion, is The Case Against Reality by Donald Hoffman. Again, a book I've mentioned before. The unfortunate thing about that book is that kind of 80% of it is waffle, but 20% of it has some really, really heretical and profound notions in it. One of them being that, as Kant says, time and space are the way we represent the world to ourselves. There really is no such thing as time and space, just like rail tracks don't meet in the distance. But Donald Hoffman says, well, what this whole thing about time and space is about is actually, this has turned out to be a very, very good representation of the world, and it helps us survive. And it helps us survive long enough to procreate, bang out some kids, and then 20 years later we die. And one of the great heresies of today is evolutionary psychology. As Jordan Peterson says, evolutionary psychology probably won't last another 10 years because it says something that is truly heretical these days. It says that men and women are different. My God, you cannot say that these days. If you want to be a heretic, just say men and women are different. Clearly they're different physically, and the kind of Marxist left and people of that nature who want everybody to be the same, the whole world to be some kind of level platform, they have to concede that men and women are different physically, because clearly they are, but they will not concede that we're different psychologically. And one of the great things about Peterson, and I've seen a lot of harsh criticism of Peterson, and the guy is a bit of an idiot. He did 113 conferences in 120 days. I mean, that is either unbridled ambition, unbridled greed, or something. And the result of it all is that he seems to have had some kind of breakdown. But you should bear in mind that he suffers from some fairly nasty autoimmune disease, which probably contributes to it. But I used, in my career when I was working, I used to have to do conference tours. If I did 6 in the space of a fortnight, I was wiped out after that. So, how on earth... Anyway, I'll keep going on about that. But Peterson says that evolutionary psychology probably won't last for 10 years because it makes these bold claims that men and women are different, not only in terms of their physical natures, but in terms of their psychology. Evolutionary psychology is really, really worth looking at. It's a bit dull in the sense that all it is endless experiments, but the experiments show you, for example, that women want men to be resourceful, men want women to be sexy. I mean, it's a very crude approximation, but those are the differences that take place. So today the heretics are saying that men and women are different. Just shows you how stupid the whole thing's got. How easy it is to be a heretic these days. Just say men and women are different. But Donald Hoffman's findings, and Donald Hoffman is a psychologist, not a physicist or a philosopher per se. He's finding that time and space are our very, very effective mechanism for helping us, our very, very effective framework for looking at reality and helping us to survive long enough to produce kids. Because we're very good at that. The human race clearly is very good at surviving and banging out kids. So, to be a heretic today is not difficult. Really, really not difficult. All you have to say to people, in fact I had a conversation with a guy a few weeks ago. We were talking about philosophy and he didn't really know much about it. I just said I was interested in Schopenhauer. He said, oh, wasn't Schopenhauer, didn't he have a bit of a downer on life? I said, oh yeah, it was a pessimist philosophy. And he just laughed as though, well, pessimism is stupid, isn't it? So all you have to do is challenge the notion that we're here to be happy. Most people will drop you like a hot potato. You just have to question the notion that everything's made out of atomic particles, and you immediately become discredited. All you have to do is question the notion that life has a meaning, and people will think you're some kind of lunatic and some hopeless loser. Question the notion that there's a moral code, an absolute moral code. Or question the notion that there's such a thing as truth. It's very easy to be a heretic. It's way more easy to be a heretic today than it was even during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. So I like the word heretic so much I might change the name of the channel to that. I think liberation through self-knowledge is probably a bit wet, but anyway, we'll see on that. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that whistle-stop tour through the heresies. And remember, if a philosophy has no heresy associated with it, it's probably worthless. Which is why much of what today is called analytical philosophy is worthless.